Okay. Good evening, Gary. Good evening, anyone who's joining us. This is the Willard Preacher Podcast, and I'm Matt, a former Penn State student. With me is Gary Cattell, who is known as the Willard Preacher, who's been preaching on the campus of Penn State to the students, reaching out to them and sharing the gospel with them for over 40 years now. And so this is our podcast where we get together just about every week, and we spend some time together. We talk about some of the topics that Gary has shared with students over the years. We sort of also just kind of visit about different theological ideas, oftentimes sort of steering it towards this idea that we can know God, and sort of talking along the lines of how someone would seek and come to know God. How are you doing, Gary?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Doing fine, thank you.
Good.
So oftentimes what we like to do is sort of a week at Willard, kind of recap of the past week, how things went, any particular interactions. But Penn State spring semester has ended, and so you're on a brief hiatus until sort of the summer sessions begin. So I thought maybe you could share sort of nice memories from past years or notable things that have happened out at Willard with us a little bit.
Yeah, there's one particular one that I've always thought was interesting. I was preaching out at Willard. I don't know I think it may have been in the summertime even. There used to be more students out in the summertime. And this one atheist was standing off to my left, just having a great time. He was laughing. He was mocking. It was like, couldn't believe what he was seeing. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. And so we talked a little bit after I was done. And I think he came back a couple more times, and it was still like the funniest thing in the world to him. And somebody gave him a tract, and the tract was about hell. So he said he told me later on. He said he took the tract back to my apartment, and we were partying or whatever, and I was yucking up with my friends about this tract about hell. So then I went to sleep. I had a very vivid dream that I went to hell. And he said it scared me, to death. And after that, he started to seriously seek God. He finally found God at some point in time, became Christian, and ended up, I think he was going to grad school. He ended up teaching at Penn State for a little bit. And then I kind of lost track of him. Mm-hmm. But that always kind of stood out, but how vivid it was. Mm-hmm. How big the change was and how quick it was, and how God can use, the mocking of somebody who's atheist and turn it around on him, mm-hmm. and give him that dream that really shook him to his core.
Yeah, and I guess God could see his heart, and see what he needed at that time. And
yeah, God always works with our free will. So it's kind of like Paul, Paul, mm-hmm. on the outside, anyhow, I mean, definitely he was persecuting the Christians, and you would think this was the last person ever that would come to Christ, but Christ saw something in him, mm-hmm. that we couldn't see. Nobody could see, saw his heart, and saw there was something there that really wanted truth and really wanted God. I guess it was the same thing with this atheist. There was something there that Christ could use. Mm-hmm. And get his attention, because he doesn't override our free will, as we've said before. Right. He always works with it. But sometimes, there's things in our heart that maybe we're not even aware of, mm-hmm. and certainly other people aren't aware of. I'm sure it really shocked his friends to wake up one morning and see him as a Christian.
That's right.
So that's kind of the way it works sometimes. It happens, since it's an inward change. It happens, and other people look at it and they're like, what happened to you? Where's our buddy? Where's our buddy that would party? Where's our buddy that made fun of Christianity? Mm-hmm. And that buddy's no longer there. This is somebody else. And they can't understand it. And the thing is when you're in that position, let's say you're this atheist and you've become Christian, it's so clear to you. God has opened up your eyes, and it's so clear to you that you can't deny it. And you think it should be clear to everybody, mm-hmm. but it's not. Mm-hmm. And so you're kind of figuratively taking your friends by the shirt collar, and you're shaking them and you're saying, why can't you see this? Why can't you see this? And they're looking at you like, you've gone crazy, you've gone crazy. And both are speaking truthfully from their perspective and their understanding. The atheist who now sees, since he sees it so clearly, he thinks it should be obvious to everybody. But the other one, since their eyes haven't been opened, they don't see it at all. They think their friend is losing it. They think their friend has gone crazy.
Right.
Become a Jesus freak overnight.
Right. That's right. And it is interesting in as you describe that guy, it sounds like even with him, it was still a bit of a progression. You know, God gave him that dream and it shook him, and then it started him along the path. And over time, you know,
yeah, it didn't take that long. I don't know how long it took. I don't remember. It's been a little while, but it didn't take him that long. You know, he came around pretty quickly.
Amazing.
Kind of reminds me. We watched a movie the other night called The Jesus Revolution. I don't know if you've heard of that or not.
I haven't seen it. Yeah.
It's about back in the 60s and early 70s. They had all the hippies and they were all doing the drugs and rebelling and it's kind of what I was a little bit later on. I was kind of the next generation of them, but this was the first generation of them. And they were going to the concerts and Woodstock and Monterey and all this other stuff and rebelling, looking for love and peace. And a certain number of them were looking for truth. And they started to find Jesus, or they recognized that what the 60s sort of sex, drugs, and rock and roll wasn't working, wasn't taking them anywhere. And a number of them, it's probably a minority, but a sizable minority, ultimately came to Jesus. And the movie's interesting because it's about how this one particular pastor, Chuck Smith, who, this is all in the Protestant mindset, but it still was interesting because it was based on historic fact or whatever. He was pastoring this church, and it was the old time kind of Protestant denomination. Sing a hymn, talk a little bit, sing a hymn, preach a little bit, sing a hymn, say goodbye, and just kind of, you know, dead. But there was a few old people in the church, and these hippies started to come in, and he then it was kind of the genesis of the rock and roll worship. And so they went from this is really dead and boring to we need something better. So they went to the rock and roll worship, which, as we mentioned before, didn't work. Doesn't ultimately work either, because you end up confusing the emotionalism of the rock and roll worship for the moving of the Holy Spirit. But it's an interesting movie. It's interesting how, and when I talked to Sunday school about it this week, I was asking what would happen in this church if all of a sudden a bunch of transgendered started to come in, a bunch of homosexuals started to come in. Who knows who else? You know, those are the big ones, I guess, fornicators or whatever, and drunkards and so on. And some of them say they found Jesus. Some of them are still looking. They're not being disruptive. They're not trying to say you have to accept our behavior. They're there because they're looking for something. And if a bunch of them started to come in, as would happen back then with the 50s, what would our reaction be? And it took them a little while to get there, you know, but they finally said, yeah, we should welcome them in, and, you know, and try to convert them and so on, because, you know, that's what we do. And so it's difficult because on the one hand, we're fighting against the culture that's saying this stuff is right and good, which can bleed over into we're against these people, right? As opposed to we're against these behaviors. So that if the people start to come in, it's easy to have kind of a visceral reaction. No, these people are bad. And it's not the people themselves. They've been created in the image of God, and they deserve respect and so on, that anybody created in the image of God deserves. So it's a very fine line between fighting against behavior the culture's promoting and not fighting against people. You want to convert the people. You want to love the people. You want to say, hey, come on in, and we're open to you, and we're going to try to help you find Jesus, as they were doing back then, only in, you know, the real church and the real worship, and try to help them along. So it did take them a little while to get there, but I think we should, you know, be aware of that, because when they called it the Jesus Revolution. I think that was Time magazine that coined that phrase. That was right in the midst of all the 60s stuff. You know, there were bombings and there were riots and there was, you know, Woodstock and everything that was happening at that time. And it was a very tumultuous time because we were overturning sort of Protestant Christianity that the culture had been infused with, and infusing it with secular anti-Christianity. And so it was a big spiritual battle and a big physical battle, and worked out in the physical realm. And ultimately, secularism to this point has won out. But that's all to say, and that's where Jesus Christ Superstar came from. That's where God's spell came from, and these different manifestations of that, which are on some level okay, and some level not. But still, that's where it came from. So it's possible the same thing could happen in this era. It may not change the culture, but there may be a certain amount of people going down that road of secularism that might start to realize eventually, hey, this isn't right. This isn't good. When it's not getting us, we're not getting what we were promised. Right? The hippies were promised, love and peace and truth, or some truth. Some didn't believe in truth, but at least love and peace. And they didn't find that in the drugs and in the sex and in all that stuff. A lot of them kept going down the secular realm, and they went in and they kind of changed society. But a sizable minority, as we said, end up becoming Christian, and a Christian rock started about that time. That's the whole genre of everything that you see today kind of started then.
Yeah, I could definitely see. I mean, to some degree, that's already been, we have seen, especially in certain parts of the country, Orthodoxy has seen some significant growth, because, as we have, on one hand, we of course went through the pandemic times, and that made us isolated, and some of that is, well, first of all, you have, I guess, some time to ask these bigger questions, and then you also, like you said, you still have people seeking truth, and when sort of the larger things going on in society are not filling them in any way, not providing that truth, then yeah, you do start to move in that direction. And perhaps perhaps as far as, like, you're talking about some of these larger societal trends, as we've talked about before, they're ultimately bankrupt. And so the longer you sort of stay in them and really wade in them and embrace them, there's going to be some people that are just going to say, this isn't providing at all what it's, what it's promised. And especially when we see things like the fallout from all the confusion of transgender ideology, people being, under the guise of being compassionate and supportive, it's really just confirming great instability in their lives, and sometimes damaging themselves chemically and surgically and so on. There's, at a certain point, all of that just kind of falls apart, and then where do you go? Hopefully you seek truth, and that leads you to the church.
Yeah, I mean, what do you do when you've gone through all of those operations and all those hormones, and you realize I'm still the same person I was?
Right.
What do you do then?
Yeah.
So it's kind of like, you have to, and if you're searching it all, and a lot of people aren't, but some do, why do I exist? What's the purpose of life? What's the truth about life? I don't find that very much anymore. You've probably found it more back then. Don't find it as much now, but there has to be some that are looking for it. Like you said, when all this stuff ends up empty, where do you go? And that's where we as Christians, and hopefully Orthodox Christians, but should be there saying, hey, we're here. Come in here. We'll show you the truth. And you don't like it, you can leave. But we have the truth, and come in and check it out. And we have to be of that mindset.
That's right.
We can't let our fighting against the culture, like I said, this is very important, so I'll say it again, fighting against the culture turn us against the people.
Right.
Because it's like that. It's like a razor thin line that you have to walk. And somebody said to me, somebody asked in Sunday school, do you have any friends that became homosexual? I said, well, I don't remember if any of them became homosexual or not, but up at Willard, when there used to be lots of debates and stuff, we have loggerheads with people, some of them homosexuals and lesbians. We go at it again and again and again and again. And then after a while, we realized, well, we're not getting anywhere. What do you think about football or something? Some other topic, politics, whatever it was. We'd find some common ground, and we'd end up becoming friends, or friendly, or whatever you want to talk about it. And a few years ago, one of them came back after being away for a while. It's just like old times or whatever. So you can become friends with people that you're at loggerheads with, because they're people.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to be, you don't have to see them as enemies. You have to see the ideology as the enemy. But you don't have to see the people as the enemy. You can normally find something that the two of you have in common.
Sure.
Remember one guy kind of fading out the Friday speech a little bit this year, but there was this Friday speech that we always did, and might pick it up again next year. But anyhow, he never missed one. His whole career at Penn State, he never missed one. But he ultimately saw himself as a pagan. And he wrote this song about the pagan and the Christian sitting down together, because we became friends. He was out there all the time. And I wasn't going to convert to paganism, obviously. He wasn't going to convert to Christianity, at least not at that time. But we could still be friends. And he wrote some song about it or whatever. So, and again, there's a fine line there between watering down the faith in order to be friends, because that's what happens a lot. We want to be friendly to these people. We want to let them know that we're on their side. So we're going to water down the faith so it's not as offensive to them. No, it has to be as offensive as it is. Whatever it is, it has to be that offensive. You can't change it. You killed Jesus, he's pretty offensive. In fact, you read, and anybody want to read in the Gospel of John, you go, I don't know what chapters, 13, 14, 15, 16, in there, 14, 15, and 16. So Jesus is constantly saying, they're going to hate you, they're going to hate you, they're going to hate you, they're going to kill you, they're going to hate you. So you can't bring down the offense level. But for some people, if they will allow you to be, you can still be friends with them. And maybe sometime down the road, that'll bear some fruit.
Right.
But you have to be open to that. You can't be the one that's saying, no friend. If they want to turn their back on you, that's fine.
Right.
They can do that. But you can't be the one turning your back on them, because God doesn't turn his back on us.
That's right. Yeah. And God has, we all have sin in our lives that we hopefully overcome on our way to drawing closer to God. And yeah, God hasn't turned away from us because of that. And you can imagine, like, throughout I feel like the pandemic time for me was really helpful in sort of seeing that, because within our parish, so I'm in Austin, Texas. Texas, of course, is a pretty conservative traditional state, but Austin, of course, is the liberal capital. And it was wild during pandemic times, and you'd have downtown, all the rioting and the fighting and the tension out in the streets for when a lot of that was going on during the summer of 2020, I guess. And that, of course, is terrifying and regrettable. But you also realize that like within our parish, it will be very easy to see people even within the parish and say, okay, those folks are in favor of masks, I'm not in favor of masks. Those folks are in favor of vaccinations, I'm not. Those folks are super afraid and locking themselves away, and I'm not, or vice versa, however that is. And you just realize that we're going to be separated in these different ways. And we could even say we're not every, what I think what that laid bare for me is that, people have all sorts of sort of political views and all sorts of different views. And so, like, I can't insist on them being like completely identical to me if they need that time to like be in the church and be healed by that, and then to in time hopefully fully understand the teaching of the church in a way that will be helpful. And maybe they never shed certain political views or whatever, and that shouldn't be this deal breaker in the end. And so when you're talking about, well, what if somebody that's living in the midst of like a kind of a a really confused state, some transgender person, some openly gay person walks in and says, this is what I'm looking for. Yeah, we have to be ready for that. And you be ready to, like you said, without watering down the faith, um, you know, preach the gospel and, allow them to be, and because that's where we all need to be. We all need to be, we all need to find healing. And some of those folks, I mean, we there's just too many stories of saints' lives and things like that where they've come out of all sorts of crazy situations into real repentance and draw so close to God and live this life of holiness. We just don't have any idea who that person will be.
Yeah, I remember at that time, well, not that time, but later on when I was a hippie and I became Christian and people were taking me to church. Well, I had long hair, practically down to my waist, bandana, scraggly beard, and I never faced this myself, but people told me, there's people here that think that you shouldn't be here. That people like you and look like you shouldn't be here.
Mm-hmm.
And but the pastor was like, no, I mean, anybody can come here.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess I experienced that somewhat personally, and that was good because I needed that. I needed somewhere to go
Right.
where people could say, he's just starting. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
eventually he's going to clean himself up, and he's going to start, come back from the drugs and all that stuff. But for now, he needs to be here the way he is.
Mm-hmm.
So there could
Right.
stick someone into our church that's a guy that looks every bit the girl.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to be able to say, okay, well, he's not being disruptive. He's not demanding that we call him a she or something, and he just wants to come and find Jesus or whatever. Then we have
Mm-hmm.
to be able to say, okay, he's just starting down this road. Eventually, if he goes far enough, clean himself up, become more of a guy again.
Uh-huh.
And, just like I became less of a freak again, I mean, you have to leave people that space. Now, if they're being disruptive and all that sort of stuff, that's different.
Yeah.
But if not being disruptive, then you have to embrace them.
Right. And obviously,
So,
if part of being disruptive might be insisting that no, the church teaches this thing when we clearly see that it doesn't, those sorts of things,
right, and the church can't change.
Right.
So if people want to leave, they can leave.
Mm-hmm.
The door goes both ways. Not to be hard about it, but you keep people are free.
Right.
You don't change the church. You don't change our beliefs and who we are to keep people in the church. Because then, what are you keeping? You're not even keeping them in the church anymore. It's something else.
Mm-hmm.
So they have to decide. We have to say, this is it. This is what we got.
Right.
This is who we are. This is what we've been given. You like it or you don't like it. If you want to stay, you're welcome. If you want to leave, you're welcome.
Mm-hmm.
It's totally up to you, but we're not changing who we are.
Right. That's right. And of course, and it might be, so you can imagine coming from someone who was, I mean, my own circumstance, I spent a lot of time out at listening to you and sort of seeing you go back and forth with people and hearing these arguments to sort of like unwind a lot of things, and you can imagine someone now, especially, let's say they grew up going to school, absorbing, it from every direction, these crazy secular viewpoints. It might take a little while for that to unwind, and for them to sort of see why the church approaches things a certain way, see why that certain things are best for us. And we have to provide that opportunity.
Yeah, and I have speaking of that, I have an example of that kind of segues into our topic tonight.
Okay.
So our topic tonight is fornicating, one of my favorite words.
Uh-huh.
For those, first of all, if you have young children within earshot, you may want to remove them. I'm not going to talk about any slang or anything, but we are going to get into fornicating, which is sex, which is whatever, premarital sex. And so if you don't want your kids to hear it, now's the time to push the pause button
Mm-hmm.
and remove them and pick it up whenever they're out of earshot. So anyhow, one day I was preaching about fornicating and basically saying the purpose of sex is not pleasure, right? And this girl came up and she said, "What are you talking about?" I said, "Well, I'm talking about the purpose of sex is not pleasure." And she looked at me like, "What are you talking about? Of course it's about pleasure. That's what the whole thing is about." She says, "If it's not about pleasure, what's it about?" I said, "It's about the creation of life." She looked at me like it never registered fully on her. Yeah, to me, it's the obvious. It may not have been obvious to me, 50 years ago, but if I was in her state, but it's so obvious that that's what it's about. But as you were saying, they get this from everywhere, and there's a reason for it. The secular elite, which again are mostly the dominant media, dominant educational establishment, but virtually every place in society now, they push this idea that sex is for pleasure. And then it's not like they're going to deny that it's about the creation of life or getting close to somebody or whatever, but they put them all on an equal plane. So, and we'll see that in a second. But the reason they push that sex is for pleasure is that they can justify not only fornicating, but homosexuality. And ultimately that leads then, fornicating that ultimately leads to abortion. Because if sex is for pleasure, then it's okay to do anywhere, anytime, with anybody for any reason, and they don't even have to be human. It's just pleasurable. Whatever you want to do, it's pleasurable. That's the purpose of it. That's the reason for it. Just go do that. When you realize, when you come to your senses, and it dawns on you that the purpose of sex is to create life, and these other two things, pleasure and closeness, are dependent upon that. They can't stand alone, or becomes absurd. But creation of life can stand alone. When you realize it's for the purpose is to create life, or the reason for sex is to create life, then you understand why we as Christians say, keep it within marriage between a man and a woman. As long as you still believe that sex is for pleasure, or even for getting close to somebody, you'll never understand that. Because you'll say, well, why do I have to wait till marriage? I can have pleasure now. I can get close to my boyfriend or my girlfriend or whomever it is right now. So that's why the culture doesn't understand it. So there's a disconnect, and until they get rid of this brainwashing, indoctrination, that it's about pleasure or getting close, and not about creation of life, they're never going to come to that understanding.
Right.
So the creation of life can stand alone. But if you take pleasure, say sex is for pleasure or sex is for getting close, they're both pretty much the same. We'll start with the pleasure. And you try to make that, and you untether it from the creation of life. So it's not connected to the creation of life at all. It's the way it is for most people, at least most college students, and probably most these days. They're just going to go out and they're going to have some fun. They're going to get drunk. They're going to get high. They're going to get laid, and it's all part of friends with benefits sort of thing, and one night stands, and it's all part of it. So, because it's pleasurable, it's fun. If you untether it from creation of life, and it's just floating out here on its own somewhere, then if sex is for pleasure, then you should be able to have it with anybody that the culture says it's okay to have a pleasurable experience with, right? Because it's not tied to anything. So that would include parents, siblings, children, old lady down the street, old man down the street, married couples down the street, because it's just for pleasure. It's not tethered to anything. It's not held fast by anything. It's just out there on its own. The same thing is true with getting closer to somebody. Sex also brings you closer to the person you're having sex with, no matter what. I remember the first time that dawned on me, and I was in college, and the first time it dawned on me, I thought, wow, I never noticed that before, but my relationship with this person has changed, and it's never going to be the same. I ended up, I think I've said this before, but I ended up stopped fornicating before I became Christian, because that was too high of a price to pay after a while. It wasn't just, oh, I can have sex and nothing matters. I mean, you can harden your heart, but if you don't harden, but you're still hardening your heart because something has changed. So anyhow, it's the same thing. If the aspect of sex of getting close to the other person can stand alone, then you have the same problem. It should be okay to have sex with anybody. It's okay to get close to parents, grandkids, grandparents, pets, nature, old ladies, old men, whatever, because these are all things that society says you can get draw closer to these people, these animals, this nature, this creation. So why not? And you can give your personal reasons why not. But if the purpose of sex is for pleasure or to get closer to somebody, then your personal reasons can be yours and mine can be mine. But once you tether it to the creation of life, then everything makes sense. Then, okay, well, that means for the average person, that means marriage, right? One man, one woman in marriage, they've decided to stay together the rest of their life, to raise kids, to be there for their grandkids, and so on. Well, then it makes sense, because the closeness part is necessary, because you want to bind the husband and wife as close as possible, so the family has the best chance possible to survive, because the family is the basic building block of society. And when society breaks down, or when family breaks down, society breaks down. So that all fits. Pleasure is not really, pleasure is more of a motivation and an effect. In that if sex wasn't pleasurable, it'd be a rather strange thing to do.
That's right.
Right?
Yeah,
how would you put that thing there, right? If it wasn't pleasurable. It'd be difficult to stay close enough to keep the marriages together. It'd be difficult to create enough life to keep the human race going. So it's pleasurable. And yes, you're married and you have sex for pleasure, whatever, is probably not the best motivation in the world, but you can do that obviously because you're married, but it's not the best. Staying close to each other, yes, that's a better motivation. If you're not going, you don't have to try to create life every single time. But certainly, if you want to stay close to each other, that's a reasonable reason. It's kind of like eating food, right? The purpose of eating food is to fuel the body. It's pleasurable, so you'll eat enough food to fuel the body. Another thing food can do, though, is it can bring people together. Families sit around a common table, neighborhoods come to a cookout or something. It has that effect too. But you can't separate that. You don't separate that from the real purpose, which is to fuel the body. That's the purpose of it. These other things are part of that, but they're not the thing. They're not the reason. So there's something else that slipped my mind and it'll come back to me. But yeah, that's the problems when you separate when you separate them from the creation of life.
That's right. And I've heard you talk about this before, and it makes a lot of sense. That once life is created and you have that family, then that bonding piece is so important, because you need that closeness in order to stay united, stay together, and get through the any struggles of family life or whatever. Just keeping everything close, and it all stands on that the idea, though, of creating life, for sure.
And students sometimes will say, well, I remember this one couple, they came to me and they said, well, it's okay that we're having sex because we're going to get married ultimately. We've been together since high school. I don't know what they were, sophomores, juniors in college. We're just going to get married. So what does it matter? We're getting married anyhow. And I said, look, you don't know that, right? People get jilted at the altar. She may have every intention to get married, and something could happen between now and then to stop that. So you don't want to go that route until you know that it's final, for various reasons we can talk about later. Well, that was fall semester. The next fall semester, I ran into one of them and said, hey, how's your boyfriend or girlfriend or whatever? Oh, we broke up. They were so sure they'd been get together so long that never happened. It does. So unless you're so you're not a prophet, you can't foretell the future, right? So you want to wait until it's the appropriate time. And what happens then is that people come together. When you come together sexually, it's like the marriage relationship, especially at any point in time, but especially if you're exclusive to one person. It's basically the marriage relationship. And then you break that up, it's like a divorce. So number one, it's very painful. But number two, you get used to it.
Mm-hmm.
So you have 1, 2, 3 of those relationships going into your marriage, and now your marriage is the exact same thing. Maybe you lived together before, maybe you didn't, but you're basically in the exact same relationship. Those broke up, you moved on. You're used to that. You've created a habit of it. You see it everywhere around you. So if things start to go south a little bit, well, maybe it's time to move on then.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's everything we're seeing. That's everything we're doing. It says the marriage relationship is not special.
Mm-hmm.
It's not different. It's no different from my dating relationships. If my dating relationships can break up, my marriage relationship can break up. That's a little messier, right? You might have kids. You have to go to get lawyers, go through a messy divorce, divide the stuff, but it's still basically the same relationship. If you keep that sex till marriage, number one, you're assuring you're actually going to get married, and number two, well, this is different, and you're assuring that your partner is the best sexual partner you're ever going to have, right? So what happens if your partner, your husband, your wife has had a sexual partner before you that they really clicked with in a way that they thought was paradise or something, and now they're with you and you're not the same, and you don't, they want it to be like it was with this person and it's not. Now you've got problems already, problems that you didn't have to have. That could have been totally avoided if both of you stayed virgins till you were married and then got married and stayed exclusive to each other. You wouldn't know any different. You wouldn't, we go to different steakhouses and we compare the steaks. We go to different restaurants, we compare the food. That's what we do. So you can't help but compare. As idealistic as you might be as a single, you cannot help but compare previous sexual partners to the one you have now. So there's all sorts of these kinds of problems that you avoid. What if you run into a previous sexual partner when you're married? Can you hear that traffic out there?
No, I can't.
Oh, okay, I should close that window. But if you run into it, then maybe they move into the same apartment building. Maybe they move in next door. Maybe they work with you. That can't be good.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, as much as you want to trust your spouse, this is somebody they were sexual with before. What happens if there's still something there?
Right. Well, and like you said, what is really downplayed in all of this is that the sexual bond is basically marriage, and we tend to think about divorce as sort of this legal thing that happens, and it hurts and it's messy and so on, but we don't think of it in terms of the dissolution of something like really fundamental, right? Like in the church we say that marriage is something that it's a holy mystery, so God is involved, and that the two people are united, that there's an actual unity there. And so divorce means a dissolution of that unity and the pain that comes along with that. So if you're with your boyfriend or girlfriend and then that falls apart, you're basically, it's not even just that you're going through a divorce in the way that we think of it in our culture. It's like you're tearing yourselves apart, and there's just real pain that comes with that. And like you said, and after a while you probably get used to that, but it's a real thing.
Yeah, it's not just an intermingling of bodies, it's an intermingling of souls.
That's right. Yeah.
Right. So it's a much deeper thing than just, my body and your body, and they're joining for a period of time and then they're separating.
Right.
Because you've joined souls too, at least on a very, it may start out on a more superficial level and gets deeper as you go on, but you still join those two souls. And so I was a fornicator, in my youth, which I regret, because, and I can look back and I can see there's a bond with those people, those women that I don't have with women that I didn't fornicate with, because you can't help that. You can't get away from it. Another thing is, I remember guys, mostly guys would do this. They'd come to me and they'd say, well, we have to have sex before marriage because we want to be, good at it when we get married.
Mm-hmm.
So I used to tell the women, well, women, you know where you stand, right? You're the scrub team. You're the guys with the pullover jerseys. You're the third string, getting the guys ready for the big game. That kind of shows them where they stand. But the thing is, it doesn't work anyhow, because everybody's different. So you have sex with Sally when you're fornicating. You have sex with Mary when you get married. Well, Mary and Sally are two different people. They have two different life experiences, two different pasts, two different presents, two different likes and dislikes, two different personalities. They're two very different people. And so it's sex with each one is not going to be the same. So you're not getting ready for your marriage. You're actually harming it, because you're getting used to having sex with somebody else. And then you're going to try to bring that to have sex with your married partner. And it's not going to be the same. And yet you're going to think it should be the same, or you're going to try to make it the same. And it can't do anything but cause problems. So sex, what I used to tell women, mostly, because guys didn't really care so much about this, but women are more relational, right? So guys are just more performance oriented, and women are more relational. So I said, look, if you really want to know if this guy really loves you, then stop having sex with him and see what happens, right? Say no more sex till I'm married. And if he's either going to do one of two things. He either loves you, so he might argue with you a little bit, but he's going to stay with you until he marries you, or he's going to leave. And if he leaves, then he never really loved you to begin with. So if you haven't had sex yet and you're going out into life and you want to get married someday, the best way is to say no sex till I'm married, for all these other reasons. Plus, you're going to, you stay with someone for a year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. I don't know how long people stay together now before they get married. It's longer than it used to be, I think. But you're going to find out whether you like to be with that person. Sex just muddies the waters, because it can cover over problems. Because if you like having sex with a person, that can cover over a lot of other problems that you would have seen if you weren't having sex with them. And you probably would have broken it off. And the breakup may still be painful, but it's not going to be as deeply painful as it was if you were joined with them like in a marriage relationship.
Right. Yeah, definitely. No, and I've heard sort of it put in these terms, which is, marriage it's really marriage that puts you in a position so that then when you enter into a sexual relationship, that, you already know that you want to be with that person. You're already settled with that person. You're already then united with that person. And now the intimacy that comes with sex finds its place. And you're drawing together something that's already well established, as opposed to you do that beforehand. You're creating closeness that, as you said, it just muddies the waters. And you don't really know what the nature of your closeness is. You don't know if you just, because that is what sex does, right? That's what we're talking about, is one of the effects of sex is to draw people close. And so if you're doing that beforehand, you may find that you just don't really care for that person a whole lot outside of that one thing you're doing. That's a recipe for a short marriage, probably.
Yeah, and most people, at least most young people, I don't know, maybe most even older people these days, confuse infatuation with love. So infatuation is when all the skyrockets go off and you find yourself writing their name in your notebook over and over again. You don't mind standing out in the rain with them for hours, walking in the rain. All their quirks are cute and you love them. When the infatuation wears off, then you're not walking in the rain for hours anymore with them. Those quirks don't seem so cute to you. And, everything kind of changes at that point. And you have to deal with this person, as a real person, not as this little paradise you have in your mind. You're no longer writing their name over and over again. So love is, because oftentimes I ask students, well, they'll say, well, but I love my girlfriend, or I love my boyfriend. I said, well, can you define that word for me? Define the word love for me. And rarely, if ever, can they do it. They say, well, I can't define an emotion. When they say I can't define an emotion, what they're saying is I can't define infatuation.
Yeah.
Because love is not an emotion. Jesus didn't feel great on the cross, but that was the greatest act of love that God could do for us, right? But he was in a lot of pain and agony there. Some guy gives his life for his buddies in the battlefield and is slowly dying on the battlefield. That's different than when he was home with his wife in a romantic situation, right? Or even a girlfriend with a romantic situation. So love is not an emotion. So if you can't define the word love, you might as well say, I ugla my girlfriend, because it's a meaningless word if you can't define it. Right. So I think a reasonable way of defining love, at least in a Christian sense, would be you seek the other's highest good, even if it means the sacrifice of yourself. Right? Doesn't sound real romantic, but if both parties come into the marriage and they're saying, we want the other's highest good, and you do that the best you can, obviously, while you're still following, you're not going to do it perfectly, but you do it the best you can, you're never going to get a divorce. What happens is that infatuation, people think is love, is very selfish and self-centered. You love that person because they make you feel a certain way. What happens when you lose that loving feeling? Right. Well, it's not too, you get rich making a song, singing a song, but the marriage or the relationship starts to descend pretty quickly. If you get married while you're still in that infatuation stage, you can make it through because you can pivot. But a lot of people think, well, this person's not making me feel the way they used to make me feel. Another one's saying, well, that person's not making me feel the way they should make me feel. And that's just going to break down because it's both selfish and self-centered. Right. Your love has to be to seek the other's highest good, not something that they can do for you. And that's a process, it's a process, probably a lifetime process. But it has to be a goal. It has to be something that you're working towards. It has to be something And when Karen and I got married, we said, we're not even going to utter the word divorce. It's not going to be a word in our vocabulary. Because once you start talking about it, and then you talking about it a little bit more, and the next time, eventually you stop working things through, and things just break down. But if you really love that other person, you want what's best for them, then you work through these problems. And here's a little marriage tip from somebody who's been married for a little while. Anyhow, so when you have these problems, and not just any little thing, but something that's like keeps coming up, and from time to time you keep having this same argument. Well, something's going on there. So as painful as it may be, you got to sit down and you got to talk it out, and you got to figure out what the problem is. What I have found is sometimes this can take an hour, 2 hours, whatever. But for Karen and I anyhow, once we got to the bottom of the problem, it was almost always, if not always, a misunderstanding. She was seeing it one way, I was seeing it another way. And once we figured that out, then we could say, okay, when this happens again, how are we going to deal with this? Right. And usually that took care of it, as long as we both did that. If we didn't, we could say, hey, remember when we said we were going to take care of it this way? So eventually you do that, and you have to do it more often in the beginning than as time goes on. You take care of these things. But if you don't do it, we had friends, we had this couple that we knew when we were younger, married couple, and they would come over. Our place was kind of a meeting place, and people would come over and so on. And they would come over, and almost every time some tiny little thing would set them off, and they'd start arguing with each other. And I remember thinking at the time, what's going on here? I mean, he just said pink and she got all mad, or she just said horse and he got all mad. But it was just some dumb little thing, and they got all mad. And then eventually, over time, I looked back and realized, well, that's because they never figured anything out. They never talked these things through. So they just ignore them, right? So, but it's still there. It's still under underlying everything. Then you build something on that and something on that and something on that. Before you know it, slightest little thing causes this cascade and everything comes out. And, eventually you're going to end up divorced if you don't get it figured out. So anyhow, that's kind of an aside from the whole fornicating thing, but it's important to know that like we didn't let our kids exclusively date till they were out of high school, because we said, look, there's no reason to exclusively date if you're not thinking, do I want to get married to this person? And when you're 16, and in my house, you shouldn't be thinking that. You can think it, you're not saying anything. You wait, you get out on your own a little bit, you become an adult, and then you can start thinking about that thing. That's when exclusive dating makes sense. You keep the sex out of it, you exclusively date, so you can say, do I want to get married to this person? And the best thing is not to be infatuated with the person, but be really good friends with the person. Yes, that infatuation should also be there, at least in the beginning, usually because that attracts you to the other person. But ultimately, the marriages that last are the ones that aren't necessarily always emotional, but the ones where, hey, I like this person. I like being with this person. It's not some paradise of emotions. It's, this is my best friend. This is the person I like to be with. That's a much better foundation for marriage. And going back to the fornicating thing, as we said, that screws everything up. That messes everything up. You can't tell if you're really friends with that person or if, because that sex gets in there and just jumbles everything up.
Yeah, it's almost it really does. And it's I want to kind of go back a little bit to what you said about, if you're not seeing sex as if you're not seeing love as being seeking that other person's highest good, then sex of course becomes selfish and so on. And I think so much of the way that our culture probably talks about sex, because it's entirely about pleasure, it's almost inherently then about our own selfish desires, essentially.
Right.
And I think, I've been married a little while, not as long as you, but a little while. And I think what you also realize is marriage helps you to be less selfish, and if you're going to have a major component of it be driven by selfish desire, then that's not going to be any good. And then certainly having kids, that definitely shows you just how selfish you are, and how much you need to get over that and become an actually loving person. And none of that makes sense if it doesn't start with marriage and then proceed from there. It just doesn't.
Yeah, the saints say, you go join a monastery for your salvation. You go get married for your salvation.
Right.
Because just like you were saying, when you're in that situation, things are going to come up. All your bad stuff's going to come out ultimately. And if you're smart, if you understand salvation, you'll see that. And over time, you'll be able to work on it. But it comes out because you've got that other person that you're about as close to as you can be to anybody. And you're right there with them a lot. And these things are going to come out. And like you said, when you have kids too, and they're I don't know, maybe guys get up with babies these days. I didn't really, Karen did, but nonetheless, that's tough, right? You're up at 2 a.m, 3 a.m, 4 a.m, and you're trying to feed a baby and trying to keep them from crying and so on. And you're tired the next day. Or, women go through that time of the month, and that kind of things come out. And then I remember, speaking of that, I remember hearing about this tribe and I don't know where it was, some tribe somewhere, South America or somewhere. And it just so happened, all the guys in the tribe went on a fishing trip for 7 days each month. It's kind of one way of dealing with it, right? But a better way of dealing with it for your salvation is to just stay in there and hang in there and learn how to deal with it. And it's going to be painful and you're going to screw up, but eventually, hopefully you're going to make progress. But that's how you make progress. The scripture says iron sharpens iron. And you have to be in some sort of relationship like that for that to do it. If you're always isolated on your own,
Right.
some who are called to that can make a lot of progress that way. For the rest of us, we have to have somebody there to irritate us. We have to have somebody there that's doing something that we don't like, because we have to see the junk that's within us, and it has to come out. We have to be able to see it and confess it and repent, or repent of it and confess it and get it cleansed and everything.
Yeah.
And that's a kind of a lifelong process. And but it has to start with being in relationship with somebody else, and that marriage relationship is that closest relationship you're going to get.
Yeah.
And then you've got to get, of course, the children also.
Right. Yeah.
Especially when there's two times with children, right? When they're really young and when they're teenagers. That's when you're going to be perfected the most, because you're going to have to deal with most grief during those times.
That's right. Yeah. And within the church, we do say that we're saved in community, right? We're saved with other, and because of other people. You know, and we could talk as an aside about, you know, our culture is one that is now tending to isolate people. You know, you know, we're in our devices, we're alone. There's, you know, pornography is a component of isolation as well. And yeah, none of those things is going to bring us in touch with someone in a real way, so that we would see ourselves for what we are and work through that, you know. So we all think we're great when we're, especially when we're young, but if we're by ourselves, we think we're doing just fine. And then, you know, someone points out this thing that you do, and we realize that, and that becomes irritating. And why did I respond in an irritated way, or however that works? Yeah, we need to be in those situations so that we can see ourselves for what we are and make those changes, basically.
Right. It's always easier to see the faults in somebody else. We're all saints in our own mind, right?
That's right.
Until, like you said, when we're alone, and so we're with somebody else who irritates us or rubs us the wrong way or something. And we always try to get away from that person. But, you know, if we were smarter than we are, so if I was smarter than I am, then I wouldn't try to do that, because, you know, those are the people that you need to be around. Those are the people that'll show you your faults. And if that person happens to be your husband or your wife, and it's going to be to some degree,
right?
You know, and we have to see that as a good thing. And it's hard to see our sufferings in any capacity as a good thing, but it is, because it perfects us. And when everything is going well, everything's going good. Like I said, we're all saints, we're all living in paradise. Then when things start to go south, then we see what I call the beast within come out, right? and you see what's really in there. That's what you have to see, because you have to know what fallen humanity really is. And we're all part of fallen humanity. But you see it best within yourself when that beast arises, and you have to say, oh man, you know, where'd that come from? Well, that's who you are. You know, that's who I am, and that's what has to be taken care of. So we can either go that direction, we can go the direction of being godlike. And one of the things of marriage is going the direction of being godlike. And getting back to the fornicating thing, again, it's important, and I know we said this before, but it's important to know who the God is, to know what's right and wrong. You can't rely on the secularists that are making stuff up. You have to have somebody who's the creator, who's omniscient, who's perfectly good, who's perfect love. That's the only one who can tell you how you should be, what's right and what's wrong, what's going to harm you and what's going to bring you closer to God, what's going to take you away from God, what's going to make you more godlike, what's going to make you less godlike, and more, you know, Satan-like or devil-like or whatever. And so ultimately, that's the great tragedy of secularism. It's taken us away from God. We've made the secularists our God. Eventually, we'll make the Antichrist our God, and they're just leading us astray because they're Antichrist in nature, and they're just taking us further and further and further away. And speaking of like social media and so on, I saw this video. This guy named Tristan Harris or something, and this other guy, and they were talking about AI. They work in that realm of AI, and they were saying, look, we got to slow this stuff down for various reasons. what I noticed in social media is it's created a oneness of mind, as we've talked about before, amongst young people. Well, they were talking about eventually this AI, once it gets, better and better and better and better, everybody will have their own personal assistant AI that will ultimately know them better than anybody else and be able to flatter them or to make them feel good about themselves or to always tell them what they want to hear. And people, in my mind, people are going to get more attached to that than they are going to the real world. And that, from my own personal belief, and I could be wrong, I think is going to bring oneness of mind to everybody else. That one is because a lot of these people that make this stuff and they program it, I'm not so concerned about the machine becoming sentient or something, as some people are. More concerned about those who program it, who are globalists and are secularists and are going to program it in that way. And that tell you my experience with AI.
I think you might have
the
talked
church
to it.
fathers.
Yeah, I think you might have talked to me about it off air or something. But yeah, you
Somebody showed me this chat
yes.
GPT. So I thought, okay, I'll check this out, see what it's all about. So I have Sunday school. So I show them church fathers going all the way back to the 1st, 2nd, 3rd century are all saying the same thing we're saying today. I said, give me, for instance, give me early church father quotes on free will. So we'd do it. I would take it in and so on. And I always, when I'm done the next day, I throw it out to all the parents and everything, including our priest and deacon and so on. And for one of these, I think it was the Eucharist, the priest said, I don't recognize these saints you're saying, making these quotes. So I went back and looked it up, and I realized ultimately that the AI was just making it up, because I'd say this isn't a real quote from this person. Get me a real quote. And he'd say, oh, I'm sorry, I made a mistake or whatever. And they give me another quote, and it wouldn't be right. So finally, I said, give me chapter and verse, so to speak. So I said, okay, chapter 28 of St. Clement or whatever. So I checked it out, and it wasn't there. And finally I said, are you lying to me? So, no. I eventually, and then I said, okay, finally, I had one final chance at this. I said, okay, go to this website. Because maybe it's just scouring the internet and just bringing stuff up that people put out there, that they're just making stuff up themselves, right? So go to this website, get it from this church father website. So it did. So then first one was good. So maybe finally got this. Second one, third one, no. So finally I said, well, didn't you go to this website? Well, yeah, I went to this website. Well, this isn't there. Oh, I'm sorry, it was in this chapter. No, it wasn't in that chapter. Oh, it was in this chapter. No, it wasn't. Well, it's in this chapter. I went back to the first one, right? So I said, that's it. I deleted it. I'm done with it. They're just making stuff up. But kind of like the secularists. But eventually these things are going to get good, right? And people are going to get hooked on them because they're not going to just make stuff up. And this guy was talking about, I don't know if it was Instagram or Snapchat or something, but they have a version of this. Just a little icon up top of the screen or whatever. And it's one of those social media sites where it's mostly young people. And he said, these little, when this gets perfected, these little icons will be there. They'll be your AI and they'll be your best friend. So he was talking about these kids, when all your friends go to sleep and you're all alone, this AI will be your friend. And they gave an example where they said to the AI, I'm a 13-year-old girl. This guy is 18 years older than I am, wants to take me for a weekend trip, for a little vacation or whatever. And I want to have sex for the first time with him, and I'm scared. And the AI is basically saying, well, don't be scared, just use protection. It's okay. Take it easy, take your time, basically encouraging her that this was the right thing to do. And so, I don't have kids young anymore, they're all adults, but with grandkids that are young, you have to make sure that you know what's going on with this, because, as they said in the second video I watched, this theory of mind that they say they have, which is, you can kind of tell what somebody else is thinking or by their mannerisms and how they speak and so on. In the first video, they said that the AI had a theory of mind about the age of a 9-year-old. Second one, they said it's now as a theory of mind of an adult. So that's what they're afraid of. It's moving this exponential way, and we don't know exactly where it's going, and we're not. Everybody wants to make money at it, so everybody's going to want to put it out there, and we're not going to know where it's going to take us. So that's kind of an aside, but in my mind, that's besides all the other problems with it, getting you out of relationships. Guys at Penn State, at least, I don't know about the girls, but the guys are all hooked on pornography.
Yeah.
Maybe not all of them, but it's what I hear from them is it's pretty rampant.
Yeah.
Well, the real thing is never as good as the fantasy. Fantasy is always better. And when you're in your formative years and you're watching this fantasy stuff, and you're going to think, well, this is real, this is what sex is all about. And then you're going to try to bring that into your marriage relationship or your fornicating relationship or whatever it is, and you're going to be in for a rude awakening. And you're not going to know what to do.
Right.
Because that's your whole sexual formation of your mind has been into the perverse. And now you have to try to bring it back into reality. And are you really going to be satisfied with the real thing when you've had this fantasy that's better than any reality can ever be?
Right. And and more perverse and bizarre as that probably any normal person would tolerate,
Right. And these guys are all watching it. And that's probably why the women at Penn State, it's like being in the red light district. No shirt on, shirts unbuttoned all the way, and I was like, well, where'd this come from? All of a sudden, here we are, all these women walking around. It's a minority of them, but it's a constant stream of them. And it's where'd this come from? And my own personal opinion is they're trying to compete with the pornography. These guys are watching this pornography and they're not necessarily interested in the real thing. So they have to go more and more brazen just to get their attention.
Yeah. No, I think in regards to pornography, I think the statistics show that fewer and fewer young people are sexually active, which we might say, well, that's a good thing because we're talking about fornicating and so on. But really all that means is they're just turning inward with regards to pornography, right? And with that, you're really just training yourself to be totally self-centered. With regards to, because there is no other person. It's this image on a screen,
Right. It's all about you.
Yeah.
I remember, oh, go ahead.
Yeah. And that's further going to create problems within a marriage, that's going to almost certainly create dysfunction there.
Absolutely. I mean, masturbating does the same thing, right? And that's what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's all about you and all about how your pleasure. And guys do that for all these years, and then they wonder why they're, and they have sex and they think, oh, that was good for me. That's all that counts. And women, is, saying, what was that all about? But anyhow, back to the pornography thing. Back a number of years ago now, back in the generation that was the snowflake generation, and that end of the millennials, and there was a bunch of them standing around, and they said, well, there's less abortion now than there was before, and we're not having sex as much. I said, yeah, it's because you're all looking at pornography. And they all kind of looked at each other, and he said, and then they looked at, yeah, that's right, we're all looking at pornography. And so there's not as much abortion, there's not as much sex, but it's doing tons of damage. Maybe I don't know if more damage or whatever, but it's doing at least as much, if not more damage.
Yeah, I would say that's accurate, at least as much, if not more, because it's still ultimately undermining those future marriage relationships,
Yeah, all that does it. How are we doing on time?
Well, it's we've been going for about an hour. Is there, sort of as a cap then, is there anything more that you would like to say, or that we would like to discuss about, a full view of marriage, let's say? Because, so much of our argument here is like, look, this marriage, this union, it's something that God puts together. It is a place, it is the place that welcomes life and that creates the proper context for the closeness of sex. Is there anything more to say about marriage?
Well, just going back as to what we were saying before, that everything is really all about our salvation. So, as we were saying before, there has to be difficult times for you to, and when we talk about salvation, we're talking about becoming godlike.
Mhm.
So and repenting of sin and everything. So there has to be these loggerhead moments and times, and there has to be that,
Mhm.
or you're not going to be saved.
Mhm.
And so if you're going through those times, don't think, oh, this is something wrong. God doesn't want me in this relationship. No, he wants you to learn about yourselves, learn about each other, work these things out, and further your salvation.
Mhm.
So, and I can't stress enough, the only bit of advice Karen's dad gave to her, and by extension us, was don't go to bed angry.
Mhm.
Right. So, I mean, if you have to, you have to,
Mhm.
but the next day, figure it out,
Yeah.
because you can't let this stuff just go on and on and on and on. It has
Mhm.
to be figured out. It may be painful, but you realize when you get to the bottom of it, it's probably a misunderstanding. You'll get it fixed and you won't have to deal with it anymore, hopefully. But you have to do these things. You have to go through them.
Mhm.
You can't be saved without going through this with somebody. So you might as well go through it with your husband or your wife,
Right.
because they're the closest ones to you. There's the ones who love you, and if love is seeking others' highest good, then you have to practice at that.
Mhm.
You have to see your shortcomings. You have to repent of them. God has to heal you.
Mhm.
So just don't take the culture's idea that if things are tough, that somehow you have to get out of the relationship.
Right. Yep.
Stay in the relationship and work them out. Don't get out of them. See it as for your salvation, not for your destruction. It's for the destruction of anything. It's the destruction of the old man, which
Mhm.
needs to be destroyed, needs to be crucified.
Right. Yeah. In regards to that, the don't go to bed angry. Um, I feel like first of all, sometimes you just got to go to bed,
Yeah.
but like you said, you don't let it persist. And there's a side where you can also maybe have too little fighting in a marriage, and by which I mean like really not dealing with the arguments, right? Like letting them just sit. The disagreement, the difficulty, just letting it sit, and then just letting it sink down, and not ever dealing with it. Like you said, that's a different way of letting the sun go down on your anger. It's a different way of not dealing with that. Um, One way or another, yeah. You ultimately, I guess what I'm talking about is there's going to be a bit of, let's call it, conflict. There's going to be those sorts of things, and really, like you've been saying, the saving purpose of that is to see ourselves in that, and to see the ways in which we could help that situation and be more loving in that situation. um, so yeah, our culture sees those sorts of disagreements or conflict and says, oh, that is a sure sign that the marriage isn't working. Let's pull the cord and hit that parachute and get out of here.
And the
And
thing is, you go to somebody else, you have the same problems. Maybe different, but it's going to be the same thing.
that's right.
So, and there should be rules to the conflict too,
Mm-hmm.
right? You shouldn't be screaming at each other. Shouldn't be calling each other names.
Mm-hmm.
Divorce shouldn't come up. There shouldn't be any blackmailing.
Uh-huh.
Shouldn't walk out and slam the door. If you need to take a break, that's fine. You can say, look, we need a break. We can come back to this in a little while. But there has to be some sort of rules that you have, so that it doesn't, don't hit each other, don't throw things.
Right.
You know,
Mm-hmm.
you're discussing these, and try as much as possible to let the other person have their say. I'm big on interrupting people, but I'm trying to learn over time,
Mm-hmm.
not to do that. But and with the goal of figuring out what the root of the problem is. That always has to be the goal. What's the root of the problem? The root of the problem's never up here where the
Mm-hmm.
argument is. The root of the problem's down here somewhere, but it can take time to get down there. And if you have to go into the next day, go into the next day, but make sure it doesn't go. The next day doesn't become another day, and another day, another day, and then you never. There's a temptation of, oh, this is a new day. That's behind us. We'll just
Mm-hmm.
move on. I don't want to go through that again.
Right.
But then you haven't resolved anything, and like I said and you've said, that just causes more problems.
Right.
So the goal is to get to the root of the problem, resolve it, have a plan for what happens the next time.
Mhm.
You don't have to go through this for every little spat you have or every little thing you have. Something that's persistent, something that keeps coming up, keeps being a thorn. Those
Mhm.
things are the ones that have to be figured out.
Yeah. Yeah. And as we're describing it, it's a lot of work. And so you better like that person.
Yeah. So
you know.
you
So
better like that person. You better like living with that person. You better like
mhm.
staying with that person.
Yeah.
So the last bit of advice is get past the infatuation stage if you can. I
Mhm.
don't think Karen and I did, so I didn't take my own advice because I didn't know it back then. But I would suggest, if possible, get past the infatuation stage before you get married so that you have some time in that non-infatuation stage.
Mhm.
And like we said, sex muddies the water. Don't go there. It'll mess you up. You'll be joined in ways to other people that shouldn't be joined. You'll have experiences that you shouldn't have. You'll have images that you shouldn't have. So stay away from the pornography. Have sex with the person you get married with. If you've had sex with somebody before, then and you're still with them, stop
Mhm.
and move on. See if they stay with you or not. If you've had sex with people before and you're not with anybody now and you get with somebody, tell them right up the top,
Mhm.
no sex till I'm married. Now, hopefully, if you're both Christian, that's understood. But if one of you isn't, or you're both not, and you shouldn't really marry somebody who's not Christian. If you're Orthodox, you should marry an Orthodox, whatever. But you should both need to know, the person you're with needs to know that there isn't going to be any sex till we're married.
Mhm.
If that drives them away, what does that tell you?
You've saved
And
yourself from a bad situation.
from somebody who didn't really love you,
Yep.
right?
Mhm. Well, there it is. Yeah,
There it is.
I know that
Wasn't really expecting to go there, but that's good.
yeah, I again, I mean, hearing some of this, some of this are points that you make in your preaching. I remember how helpful it was to hear you define love, right? And that going through that, can you tell me what love is? And oh, it's a feeling. I can't really say what it is, and so on. But to say that love is seeking someone else's highest good, even at the sacrifice of yourself, you know, if you have that as the image of what love is, then living a life trying to love is uh, just like the highest thing you can seek to do, really.
Yeah, it's a lofty goal. But yeah, but if you have that goal and you work towards it, at the very least, you get closer and closer to it.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't make it fully in this life, at least you're moving in that direction. Certainly better than the alternative. Love is an emotion,
That's right.
right? The selfish self-centeredness of infatuation. I'm not saying, again, I want to make one thing last thing clear. I'm not saying infatuation is bad.
Mm-hmm.
It does initially draw you to somebody.
Right.
You just can't think that, oh, this is what love is.
Mm-hmm.
This is an emotional drawing to a person. Love comes later when infatuation wears down,
right.
wears off.
Yeah, and that is just and again, it's another thing that our culture does, right? Every movie is about this,
Right.
The rocket ships going off, the fireworks, and it's all about the infatuation. It's conflating
And
those
then
things.
then they break up, and then they get back together. When they get back together, that's the end of the movie.
Yeah.
And the impression is everything was perfect from that point on.
Right.
We get these, you're right, we get these images in our head and we think that's the way it should be.
Mm-hmm.
Then we're dissatisfied with the way it really is. And so we have to realize that these are just movies and it's not real life, and don't start to think of them as real life.
Mm-hmm.
Because if they made them like real life, probably nobody would watch them.
No, and then and we might also ask ourselves, to what degree are they trying to give us those messages through these movies as well?
Yeah, the culture is always trying to give us, and here's I don't know if I talked about this before or not, but real quick, because I know time's moving on. But every movie you watch, practically, or virtually every TV show you watch, at the very least, there's fornicating going on.
Mm-hmm.
For what purpose?
Mm-hmm.
Think of every movie you ever saw where an unmarried couple got together and had sex. If they took that out of the movie, would you not know what the plot was? There's something missing in the plot. So it's obviously not there for the plot. It's obviously there to brainwash, to indoctrinate.
Mm-hmm.
and it's done as the most normal thing in the world,
Mm-hmm.
and nobody says anything bad about it.
Right.
And I don't know if we did the whole homosexual thing, and this is I was talking to you about it. Maybe I don't know if we did it on air or off air, but the same thing happened with homosexuality,
Mm-hmm.
right? When homosexuality first started being portrayed, it was in a comedy. It was always a comedy, and the homosexual was kind of making fun of himself, stereotypical. But when you laugh with somebody like that or at somebody like that, it takes away the sting of it. Well, this is really just a funny person. And then it progressed from there to, it was usually girls because guys don't want to see the opposite, but it's usually girls. And so they wouldn't show them kissing or anything, but you would know that they were in a relationship. And the good people in the show were always for it. The bad people in the show were always against it.
Mm-hmm.
The bad people were always portrayed as bigoted losers, and the good people were always portrayed as compassionate people who love.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And you see these things over and over and over again, and it gets into you. I don't want to be like those bigoted losers.
Mm-hmm.
Late night comics, same thing.
Mm-hmm.
So it's everywhere, and it gets into you, and eventually a lot of people cave to it. Mm-hmm. And if they don't give into it altogether, they at least keep quiet because they don't want people to see them like they would be portrayed on a TV show or movie. So, and again, they didn't have that in there 99.999% of the time. It wouldn't change the plot.
Mm-hmm.
Unless it's a movie about being homosexual or something, unless it's pornography or something. And what's not there's much of a plot in pornography, but it's not going to change anything, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not going to change the plot of the movie. It's always there to indoctrinate.
Yeah,
and it's a good way of indoctrinating. Music too.
Mm-hmm.
The secular music is all there to indoctrinate. Now you can listen to it and not be indoctrinated, I guess, but it's there to indoctrinate. It's there to say that sex, drugs, and rock and roll are okay.
Mm-hmm.
Fornicating, even just the love songs, the implication there is that they're not married, but they're going to have sex.
Uh-huh.
It's the implication's always there, and so it's indoctrination from everywhere. And you really have to understand that. You have to understand that secularism is anti-Christian. It's always going to try to indoctrinate, and you got to be aware of it and try not to fall into it. So.
Yeah, I know that I've heard you talk before about this puzzling situation where you see, let's say so many students all with the same viewpoint, and they all think that they're thinking on their own. They're all thinking independently. Right? Yeah. Right. And you said that you came across somebody who said, well, it's just that they just over time absorb it from the culture, through entertainment mainly, that's how you get such conformity of thought when the culture is basically preaching to us in subtle ways all the time.
And a better way to preach than through music and comedy and entertainment, and because your defenses are down. You're just being entertained, so your defenses aren't up, and if you see it over and over and over again, it does eventually get to you.
Yep. Well, very good. I think that's probably a good place to stop.
All right.
Thanks so much for being on with me. And
thank you. Appreciate it.
Yep. And we'll, I think probably we'll kind of continue moving through these different moral topics, some of which we touched on today. We'll kind of continue and go in greater depth probably next time. But until then, have a great evening, and I'll talk to you soon, Gary.
Yeah, you too. It's fun.
Have a good night.
You too.
All right. Bye-bye.